Cold winter nights couldn't stop him. Rain, snow, storms, nothing could keep him away. Cemetery guard Mehmet had been wondering what this old man did every night for exactly 2 hours in that remote corner, until that night when he silently followed him. The clock tower of Greenwood Cemetery struck 11 as the wrought iron gates creaked in the November wind. Most nights, this was when the world went quiet. Most nights, this was when Mehmet Özkan settled into his security booth with a thermos of tea and yesterday's newspaper. But tonight was different. Tonight, he was going to solve a mystery that had been keeping him awake for 3 months. It started in August. Mehmet had been working the night shift at Greenwood for almost 5 years, and he knew every regular visitor, every groundskeeper, every delivery schedule. But this man, this elderly figure who appeared precisely at 11 p.m. every single night, was something new, something that didn't fit the pattern. The first time Mehmet saw him, he assumed it was a grieving widower, perhaps someone who found peace in the quiet hours, away from the daytime crowds of mourners. But as weeks turned into months, Mehmet began to notice things that didn't make sense. The old man never carried flowers. He never knelt at a grave. He never lit a candle or left a photograph. Instead, he carried a worn military duffel bag and a small folding stool. He would walk the same route every night, past the veterans section, past the children's memorial, straight to the oldest part of the cemetery, where the headstones were cracked and weathered, where most visitors never ventured. And there, in that forgotten corner, he would sit for exactly 2 hours. Mehmet had tried to approach him once, back in September. Professional curiosity, he told himself, just making sure everything was okay. But as soon as the old man heard footsteps, he would pack up his things and disappear into the maze of monuments, moving with surprising agility for someone who looked to be in his 70s. Tonight, Mehmet was taking a different approach. He waited until 10:55 p.m., then positioned himself behind the large marble angel that marked the Morrison family plot. From here, he had a clear view of the main path, but remained hidden in the shadows. His breath formed small clouds in the cold air as he watched the entrance. At exactly 11 p.m., the figure appeared. Even in the darkness, Mehmet could see the man's military bearing, straight shoulders, measured steps, eyes scanning the environment with practiced awareness. He wore a dark wool coat over what looked like an old service uniform, and he carried the same duffel bag Mehmet had seen dozens of times before. But tonight, Mehmet noticed something new. As the old man passed under one of the cemetery's dim security lights, something metallic caught the reflection. A badge. Or maybe medals. Whatever it was, it suggested this wasn't just any elderly visitor. The man followed his usual route, and Mehmet followed at a distance, staying low behind headstones and monuments. His security boots were soft-soled, designed for quiet patrols, but he still moved carefully. This man had the awareness of someone who'd been trained to notice being watched. They walked for nearly 10 minutes through the winding paths of the cemetery, past the elaborate Victorian mausoleums, past the simple granite markers of the 1940s, deeper into the section where the headstones grew older and the maintenance became sparse. Finally, the old man stopped. Mehmet crouched behind a large oak tree and watched as the figure set down his duffel bag and unfolded his small stool. But instead of sitting immediately, he began to unpack items from the bag. Even from 50 feet away, Mehmet could see the methodical, practiced nature of the movements. First came a small LED lantern, which cast a gentle circle of light around the immediate area. Then a thermos, probably coffee, Mehmet thought. Then something that made him lean forward, straining to see more clearly. Tools, cleaning supplies, a small brush, a container of what looked like polish. The old man was cleaning headstones, but not just one headstone. As Mehmet watched, transfixed, the man moved from grave to grave in a systematic pattern. He would kneel beside each weathered marker, carefully brush away leaves and debris, then use a cloth to wipe clean the carved letters and dates. Some stones were so old and neglected that it took several minutes of careful work to reveal the inscriptions underneath. And as he worked, he spoke. Mehmet couldn't hear the words from this distance, but he could see the man's lips moving as he tended each grave. Not prayers exactly, more like conversations. 20 minutes passed, then 30. The old man continued his methodical work, moving between graves with purpose. And slowly, Mehmet began to understand what he was witnessing. These weren't random graves. These were all military graves. Veterans from different eras, different wars, but all marked with the same small bronze military medallions that had turned green with age and neglect. Graves that had been forgotten by time, by families, by a world that had moved on. But not by this man. Mehmet felt something tighten in his chest as he watched the elderly figure clean the headstone of someone named PFC James Mitchell, 1925 to 1944. The old man spent extra time on this one, carefully polishing the bronze medallion until it reflected the lantern light. Then, he sat back on his stool and spoke to the grave for several minutes, gesturing occasionally as if engaged in a real conversation. The wind picked up, rustling the bare branches overhead. Mehmet shivered and pulled his jacket tighter, but he couldn't look away. There was something both heartbreaking and beautiful about this scene, this solitary figure, conducting his own private memorial service in the forgotten corner of a cemetery, night after night. Another hour passed. The old man had cleaned and tended to nearly a dozen graves, treating each one with the same careful attention and respect. Some received just a quick cleaning and a few spoken words. Others seemed to require longer conversations, as if the old man was catching up with old friends. It was nearly 1 a.m. when he finally began to pack up his supplies. Everything went back into the duffel bag in the same methodical order it had come out. The lantern was turned off last, plunging the corner of the cemetery back into darkness. But instead of leaving immediately, the old man did something that made Mehmet's breath catch. He stood at attention, raised his right hand to his temple, and rendered a crisp military salute to the collection of graves around him. He held the salute for a full 10 seconds, then lowered his hand and whispered something into the night. Only then did he pick up his bag and begin the long walk back to the cemetery entrance. Mehmet remained hidden behind the oak tree until the figure disappeared completely from view. Then he waited another 10 minutes before emerging from his hiding spot and walking over to the area the old man had been tending. What he saw in the beam of his flashlight made him understand why this nightly ritual was so important. The dozen graves that had been cleaned and polished looked transformed. Headstones that had been barely readable now showed clear names and dates. Bronze military medallions gleamed like they were newly installed. Small American flags had been placed beside several graves, flags that Mehmet was certain hadn't been there before tonight. But it was more than just the physical transformation. There was something about this corner of the cemetery that felt different now. Less forgotten, less alone. Mehmet knelt beside the grave of PFC James Mitchell, the one the old man had spent the most time with. He used his flashlight to read the inscription clearly for the first time in years. James Robert Mitchell, Private First Class, United States Army, 1925 to 1944, killed in action, Normandy Beach. 19 years old. Just a kid. As Mehmet stood up, something caught his eye. Tucked discreetly behind the headstone was a small laminated card, protected from the weather by a clear plastic sleeve. He picked it up and read by the light of his flashlight, "Jimmy, I promised your mom I'd look after you. Still keeping that promise. Your friend always, Frank." Mehmet felt tears prick his eyes as he replaced the card exactly where he'd found it. He looked around at the other graves, now wondering what similar promises and connections existed in this forgotten corner. As he walked back to his security booth, Mehmet's mind raced with questions. Who was this Frank? How did he know these soldiers? Why had he taken on the responsibility of caring for their forgotten graves? But more importantly, what kind of man dedicates every night of his life to keeping promises made decades ago? The next evening, Mehmet found himself waiting by the cemetery entrance at 10:55 p.m. But this time, he wasn't planning to hide. This time, he was planning to introduce himself. The old man appeared on schedule, same coat, same duffel bag, same purposeful stride. But as he approached the gates, Mehmet stepped out of the shadows. "Excuse me, sir," he said gently. "I'm Mehmet, the night security guard here. I was wondering if I could have a word with you." The old man stopped, his posture immediately becoming more alert. Up close, Mehmet could see he was probably in his mid-70s, with silver hair and pale blue eyes that held the kind of steady gaze that comes from years of discipline and service. His coat was open just enough to reveal the dress uniform underneath. Marine Corps, from the look of it. "Is there a problem, son?" the man asked. His voice was gravely but kind. "No, sir, no problem at all," Mehmet replied quickly. "I've just noticed you've been visiting regularly, and I wanted to make sure you had everything you needed. It gets pretty cold out here at night." The old man studied Mehmet's face for a moment, as if assessing his sincerity. Then his expression softened slightly. "Name's Frank Delacroix," he said, extending a weathered hand. "Staff Sergeant retired. I appreciate your concern, but I'm fine. Just paying my respects." "I don't mean to pry, sir," Mehmet said carefully, "but I couldn't help but notice you spend quite a bit of time in the older section. Those military graves back there. They don't get many visitors." Frank's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. That's exactly why they need visitors. There was something in his tone that told Mehmet this conversation could go either way. He could push and potentially lose the chance to understand what he was witnessing, or he could show respect and maybe earn the old Marine's trust. "My grandfather was military," Mehmet said quietly. "Korean War. He used to tell me that the worst thing that could happen to a soldier wasn't dying in battle. It was being forgotten afterward." Frank's expression changed completely. The wariness faded, replaced by something that looked like recognition. He set down his duffel bag and really looked at Mehmet for the first time. "What branch?" he asked. "Army, 101st Airborne. He made it home, but, well, he said a lot of his friends didn't. And he said too many of them ended up in places like this, with no one left to remember them." Frank nodded slowly. "Your grandfather was a wise man." He paused, then seemed to come to a decision. "Walk with me, son. Let me show you something." As they walked through the cemetery toward the old section, Frank began to talk. His voice was quiet, but it carried clearly in the still night air. "I enlisted in the Marines in 1968, he said. "Served 2 tours in Vietnam. Made it home in one piece, which was more than a lot of good men could say." He paused at the turn toward the military section. "But I learned something over there. I learned that we're all responsible for each other, on the battlefield, in the barracks, in life. We take care of our own." They reached the area where Mehmet had watched Frank work the night before. In the darkness, the graves looked abandoned again, but Mehmet knew that was just the lighting. He knew what care and attention they had received just 24 hours ago. Frank set down his bag and turned to face Mehmet. "These boys," he said, gesturing to the graves around them, "most of them died before I was even born. World War II, Korea, early Vietnam. I never served with them, never knew them personally. But they're still my brothers." He knelt beside the grave of PFC James Mitchell and ran his hand along the top of the clean headstone. "I started coming here about 15 years ago. My wife had just passed, and I was looking for something to do with my time. Something that mattered. I was walking through here one evening when I found this section." Frank's voice grew quieter. These graves were in terrible shape, overgrown, dirty, some of them so weathered you couldn't even read the names anymore. And I thought about all the mothers and fathers and wives who had buried these boys with pride and honor, never imagining they'd end up forgotten in a corner of a cemetery. He stood up and looked around at the collection of military graves. "So I made them a promise, the same promise I would want someone to make to me if I ended up in a place like this. I promised I'd remember them. I promised I'd keep their memory alive, and I promised I'd make sure they never had to lie here alone and forgotten." Mehmet felt a lump forming in his throat. "Every night?" "Every night," Frank confirmed. "Rain or shine, sick or healthy, they served every day they were called upon. The least I can do is show up every day to honor that service." Frank opened his duffel bag and began unpacking his supplies. The same lantern, the same cleaning materials, the same careful organization Mehmet had observed the night before. "But it's more than just cleaning," Frank continued as he worked. "Each of these boys has a story. I've spent years researching their lives, their families, their service records. I know where they served, how they died, who they left behind. And when I sit with them each night, I share those stories. I tell them about their families, about what's happened in the world since they've been gone. I make sure they know they haven't been forgotten." As if to demonstrate, Frank knelt beside a headstone marked Corporal William Hayes, 1920 to 1943, and began cleaning the bronze military medallion. "Billy here was killed at Guadalcanal," he said conversationally, both to Mehmet and to the grave. "He was from a small town in Ohio, had two younger sisters and a sweetheart named Dorothy, who waited for him for 3 years before accepting that he wasn't coming home. Dorothy lived to be 94, and she never married anyone else." Frank finished polishing the medallion and moved to the next grave. "I track down information about their families when I can. Sometimes I find relatives who even know their great-grandfather or great-uncle is buried here. I let them know, share the stories, make sure they understand what kind of men their ancestors were." "That's incredible," Mehmet said, genuinely moved. "How many graves do you tend to?" 43 in this section," Frank replied without hesitation, "and I know every single story." They worked together for the next 2 hours. Frank showed Mehmet the proper way to clean the different types of headstones without damaging them, how to polish the bronze medallions so they gleamed, how to arrange the small American flags so they stood properly in the wind. But more than that, Frank shared the stories. As they moved from grave to grave, he told Mehmet about each soldier, their hometowns, their families, their service records, their final moments. Some stories were heroic, others tragic, but all of them were told with deep respect and genuine affection. It was nearly 1 a.m. when they finished. Frank packed up his supplies with the same methodical care, and then, just as Mehmet had witnessed the night before, he stood at attention and saluted the collection of graves. This time, Mehmet stood beside him and saluted as well. As they walked back toward the cemetery entrance, Frank was quiet for a long time. Finally, as they reached the gates, he stopped and turned to Mehmet. "I'm 76 years old," he said. "I won't be able to do this forever. I've been wondering what will happen to them when I'm gone." He paused, studying Mehmet's face in the dim light. "Would you consider helping me? Learning their stories, understanding what needs to be done?" Mehmet felt the weight of the request. It wasn't just about cleaning headstones or placing flags. It was about becoming the keeper of memories, the guardian of stories that would otherwise be lost to time. "Yes, sir," he said without hesitation. "I would be honored." Frank smiled, the first smile Mehmet had seen from him all evening. "Then I'll see you tomorrow night, son. Same time." As Frank walked away into the darkness, Mehmet remained by the cemetery gates, looking back toward the old military section. He thought about the 43 stories he would need to learn, the 43 promises he would help keep, the 43 lives that would continue to be remembered because one old Marine refused to let them be forgotten. 3 months later, Mehmet found himself kneeling beside the grave of Staff Sergeant Frank Delacroix in the newer section of Greenwood Cemetery. The headstone was simple and clean. Frank Joseph Delacroix, Staff Sergeant, United States Marine Corps, 1947 to 24. He kept his promise. In his hands, Mehmet held a folding stool and a worn duffel bag filled with cleaning supplies. Behind him stood a group of people he had never expected to see, dozens of family members of the 43 soldiers Frank had tended to for 15 years. Word had spread through genealogy websites and military forums about the Marine who had kept their ancestors' memories alive. They had come to pay their respects, not just to Frank, but to the forgotten soldiers he had adopted as his own brothers. As the sun set over Greenwood Cemetery, Mehmet made his way to the old military section. 43 clean graves waited for him, each with a fresh American flag, each with a story he now knew by heart. He set up his lantern, unpacked his cleaning supplies, and began the work that would continue every night for as long as he was able. Because some promises are too important to break, some memories are too precious to lose, and some acts of love are too sacred to let die. At exactly 1 a.m., Mehmet stood at attention and saluted the 43 soldiers who would never be forgotten. Thanks to one old Marine who understood that taking care of our own doesn't end with death. It ends with memory. And in the quiet corners of cemeteries everywhere, that memory lives on. In our darkest moments, kindness still finds a way. Often in the quietest places, not everyone who helps wants recognition. Some just need to know that today, someone isn't forgotten, and sometimes that alone is enough to change eternity. You may forget the story, but if no one retells it, history stays silent forever. Subscribe to True Heroic Stories, where justice is honored, kindness is remembered, and no act of quiet heroism is ever lost.